Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson and Michael Grumbine.
Welcome to episode 131 of Exploring Tolkien. That means in about 2 months, Michael, 2.5 months, we're going to have our 3-year anniversary, which is kind of crazy.
Yep, it is. It's interesting because it does feel like some of the chapters that we covered of the Silmarillion were recently, and
yeah,
it's funny how memory works.
But then, Michael, you think about when the Rings of Power first came out, and how long ago that kind of seems, but not long enough.
Thanks for the memory.
But speaking of the Rings of Power, hey, just so you guys know, we are going to go over the Hobbit again this week, and thank you for giving us the grace for doing this every other week for a period of time for us as we settle into other things and new things and life changes and all that sort of stuff. But the Rings of Power, season 3, we mentioned a couple weeks ago, has not been officially renewed. Well, I am here to unhappily tell you, yes, the Rings of Power has officially been renewed for season 3, but don't expect much change. This actually comes originally from a Hollywood Reporter article where it was officially renewed.
Oh, good. The frenemy bromance scene. That's wonderful.
It's back. And they're going to jump forward several years from the events of season 2 and season 3, and it takes place at the height of the War of the Elves and Sauron as the Dark Lord seeks to craft the one ring that will give him the edge he needs to win the war and conquer all Middle-earth at last. I don't know. The whole thing of this, like where everything is mixed up and all the time placement of all the rings, I'm still annoyed. Of course, I'm annoyed about everything for this here. So anyway,
right.
It's usually back.
I do think it's a kind of lazy carte blanche move that they give that modern corporate media that redoes old IPs give themselves, where they say out the gate, oh, this is different. We're gonna start changing things, and then after that point, where we've made some changes, now it doesn't matter what we change because we've changed all this other stuff. So
that's right. It's a new thing now.
Now we can just make it more funhouse mirror than you ever thought possible, and
it's the butterfly effect, right? Taken to an extreme here. We changed something early on, and now we're so far afield that we're in a completely different continent. No longer the same field.
Yep. I just keep getting, every time I see Rings of Power pictures or news that pops up in my feed, I just keep getting that old dog drinking his tea in a burning room meme in my head.
Everything is fine.
This is fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so true. Anyway, at least it won't be out. It's just pre-production, which means that it's not going to be out until next year. So we've got more than a year to work.
Next year is in 2026?
2026. Yeah.
Okay. I have to admit, I can't even bring myself to read most of the news that comes out about Rings of Power because it's and I mean, what an indictment that is. I'm a diehard Tolkien fan, and this is supposed to be, the height of the Second Age drama and epic, storytelling, and they can't even get me to read an article about it because they're so bad that I just they've killed all the joy in my heart.
I mean, we were forced to watch it all, so you don't want to force yourself to have to do anything you don't have to do. So right. Why read more when it's out there? So anyway, guys, just wanted to let you know, keep you up on it. We still haven't heard anything more about The Hunt for Gollum or any of the the Gollum movies that are coming out that Andy Serkis is directing, and apparently Viggo Mortensen's going to be de-aged in it. So we'll see.
Ugh.
All right, let's move on, everybody. Yeah, okay. So despite us doing this once every 2 weeks, we still do have our monthly chat for all our members. It's Monday night. It's actually, this comes out the night after we held our chat. So this will be February 17th is when we're going to hold this chat. And then we'll do it again, probably like the second or third Monday in March. So if you want to join, make sure you sign up at theonering.com/member.
if you want to join, invent a time machine and go backwards one day after listening to this and join our chat, or join our chat in March.
That's easier. The time machine is asking a little bit too much. I know our listeners are amazing, but they're not scientists.
Yeah.
All right, so become a member, theonering.com/member, $4 a month, or go to Patreon, theonering.com/Patreon. It's $5 a month there, and you get that. You get our Discord chat, you get our extended podcast, and all the accoutrements therein. Thanks for all our members, especially Lynn and Rich, who are still our sponsors and giving above and beyond the call.
They're awesome.
So
They're rocks.
We have many other $4 members, and we really appreciate you all every week helping us do this and keeping us going, even when we are at 50% capacity. So, all right, that means that it's officially time to get into
Hobbit Facts.
Okay. So, I say that every time we do this. Okay.
At least you have the self-awareness to know. Ooh, nice.
I've read this book, Bandersnatch, and I mentioned it, I think, a couple weeks ago. This is it's the subtitle is C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, and the Creative Collaboration of the Inklings. It's by Diana Glyer. So the Inklings were meeting while Tolkien was writing The Hobbit, and so C.S. Lewis would give his feedback about what he thought about The Hobbit. And then, as Tolkien was even thinking about The Lord of the Rings and what to do, C.S. Lewis gave him feedback very early as Tolkien was writing it. So what Tolkien did was he started writing the sequel to The Hobbit, or as The New Hobbit, I think they called it then. There was a lot of Hobbit talk. There was a lot of conversations between hobbits, and because Tolkien, as he said many times, Tolkien loved hobbits, and he loved the whole idea of it, and the Shire and the countryside and the world he had built there. And so he for instance, he wrote this here. He said, "I'm personally immensely amused by hobbits," this is Tolkien speaking, "as such, and can contemplate them eating and making their rather fatuous jokes indefinitely, but I find that it is not the case with even most of my devoted fans." So he knew he liked hobbits even more than the most devoted fans, although he hasn't seen, there was no cosplay back then, so maybe things are different now. Then on July 24th, 1938, he met C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis listened carefully to Tolkien's frustrations with his story. He gave Tolkien a short, clear, transforming piece of advice. Tolkien records, "Mr. Lewis says hobbits are only amusing when in un-hobbit-like situations." And so he was stuck up at that point. He had been writing it for like 6 months or so, and he couldn't get outside of Hobbiton. He couldn't get outside of the Shire. And so when C.S. Lewis told him this, he took it to heart. And as Glyer writes here, as a direct result of that conversation with Lewis, he immediately began to consider a more ambitious purpose. He tried to bring some sort of un-Hobbit-like seriousness and weight to the new story. The new direction can be seen in the changes Tolkien made to a key scene in Chapter 3. In the first draft, 3 hobbits named Bingo, Odo, and Frodo have left Hobbiton and are walking through the Shire. They hear the sound of hoofbeats and drawing near. Frightened, they hide amidst a cluster of tree roots in a little hollow beside the road, right? This is what we know is, what we all know what's coming is the Nazgul. But suddenly, round a turn came a white horse, and on it sat a bundle, or that is what it looked like, a bundle, a small man wrapped entirely in a great cloak and hood, so that only his eyes peered out and his boots in the stirrup. So the horse and rider stopped near Bingo, and the figure uncovered its nose and sniffed, and then sat silent as if listening. Suddenly a laugh came from inside the hood, and it is Gandalf arriving at long last after an anxious delay. He calls out, "Bingo, my boy," as he throws aside his wrappings. So at this point, he changes this, and he changes it to the Nazgul, where there's a black horse, and it's not a hobbit pony, and on it sat a large man who seemed to crouch in the saddle, wrapped in a great black hood and cloak. So immediately he was like, okay, this Gandalf coming to them is just another hobbity situation. So C.S. Lewis's advice is like, dude, just get them out of Hobbiton, get them out of their comfort zone, and you've got an entirely new story. And that's what he did. He changed Gandalf to the Nazgul for the first time right there. Didn't know what they were even, but he created the beginnings of the Lord of the Rings with C.S. Lewis's advice there at the end of the Hobbit. After he,
that's really interesting, and it's a very sharp observation, which I've only come to intuitively. But now that I'm ever since you read his line that hobbits are only does he say interesting? What is this? What is it? What's his adjective that he uses?
Hobbits are only. Well, let me get to the right page. One sec. Mr. Lewis says hobbits are only amusing
Right?
when in unhobbit-like situations. Meaning, he thought he thought hobbits were amusing, but nobody else did when they were in hobbit-like situations. So, in order to make them endearing, they can't be. Their hobbitness has to shine in next to the dwarves, next to the elves, next to the humans, in Aragorn, in Bree, when they're scared by the Nazgul and how they interact and how they react to that.
And if you think about everything from The Hobbit through The Lord of the Rings, that is just a very common thread that he goes back to over and over again. You have, everything, like, even even near the end of The Lord of the Rings, you have Merry and Pippin, each in their separate cultures. Merry contrasted with the horse culture of the Rohirrim, and Pippin contrasted with the high, noble, and cold society of Minas Tirith. But here in The Hobbit that we're reading right now, so many of the thoughts are Bilbo's the contrast between what Bilbo desires, his warm breakfast, tea, and lazing around on the lawn when he's stuck up in an eagle's eyrie from the beginning of this chapter, but all the way through, everything is contrasted. His experience versus Beorn's house, his experience versus the dwarves' experience, like everything. What he wants is always Hobbit-like, and what he's surrounded by is un-Hobbit-like. And that contrast, that high contrast, is what makes things interesting and makes Hobbits amusing. And I can't agree more with C.S. than I do with C.S. Lewis on that comment. That's really, really insightful, I think.
It's insightful, but boy, is it kind of obvious. And even Tolkien, as he was writing it, I'm sure he thought the same thing. He's like, yeah, you're right. I took Bilbo outside of Hobbiton and it became interesting. Everybody liked it. It was more amusing than to everybody, not just to me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. There you go. That's the Hobbit fact. If it wasn't for C.S. Lewis, we still wouldn't have the Fellowship of the Ring, and we wouldn't have the insight that hobbits are only amusing when they're not in the Shire. Or if the Shire changes and then the Hobbit bows twang and they take out Saruman and Grima.
That was the briefest summary of the last part of the book I've ever heard. If the Shire changes and the hobbits go twang and take out Saruman, the end.
Isn't that what it says? Like Hobbit bows twang or something like that?
Grima Wormtongue. Grima took out Saruman. Whatever.
That's true. Yes, sorry. Yeah. Well, it was part of the whole situation there. All right, let's jump into Chapter 7, the second half of Chapter 7. This is episode 19 of The Hobbit. Queer Lodgings. We are in Beorn's house, and Gandalf has finished telling his tale. Beorn calls it a very good tale, the best I've heard for a long while. If all beggars could tell such a good one, they might find me kinder. So the tale, as we mentioned last week, it's a very Norse thing, right? Beorn is very Norse. He has this, he's in essentially this longhouse that is a very much a replica of what Tolkien understood Beowulf's to be. And so he loves his tales. And that's what draws him to actually appreciate Gandalf and the dwarves. But as we'll find out, he doesn't fully trust the tale necessarily. And that's where we are now. So, Michael, why don't you give us a recap of this second half of the chapter, and then we'll go through it a little bit in detail.
Sure. Yep. So the second half of the chapter is interesting because not a lot happens, although a lot of ground is covered. But we ended the first part of the chapter from our last podcast with the end of the tale, and immediately Beorn. It's kind of like the tale is kind of. I think, I don't know if I said this last time, but it's kind of a wage by a wanderer. So the stranger is taken in oftentimes. Laws of hospitality being what they are. But the stranger also gives something. In this case, the stranger gave an excellent tale, and which is currency in the old world. And so anyway, the payment, the hospitality, is shown by Beorn in the form of first a meal. And what was so interesting is I could have sworn when I read it before that they had said something about how the meal had no meat in it, but it doesn't. It doesn't say that. I was noticing that this time. So I, for some reason, I thought that there was that the fare was non meat based, which of course, Beorn being a bear, I don't see, but there's this weird juxtaposition, right? So the first thing that happens is the meal is set up by Beorn's talking animals, who can not only talk, but they can walk on their hind legs, and the dogs can use their forepaws like human hands. So they carry in torches and they set out meals, and they later prepare the hobbits and the dwarves place in Gandalf's beds. And so the servants, essentially, of Beorn are these talking animals that can walk on their hind legs, which is very odd. They have a wonderful meal, and then Beorn leaves, and the dwarves begin to sing, because of course they do, because this is another chapter in Tolkien, and so they sing, and their song is very interesting. We'll talk about that a little bit, but anyway, Gandalf abruptly tells them after the end of the song, or a few songs, it's time to go to bed. They all go to bed, yeah. And Bilbo wakes up in the middle of the night and hears something moving around and wonders if it's Beorn in bear shape, very much on the nose, probably is, and then he goes back to sleep, and they wake up again, and they spend a whole day, the dwarves and the Hobbit do, in the house of Beorn, because Beorn is gone, and Gandalf is gone too, by the time the Hobbit wakes up anyway. So Bilbo and the dwarves sort of hang around and eat and wait for Gandalf and Beorn to come back. Beorn does not, but Gandalf does by the end of the day, and he eats a lot, and then tells them how he had followed Beorn's tracks and had found what what appeared to be the spot of the meeting of a whole bunch of bears, and some of them dancing apparently. And then he followed what appears to be Beorn's track over the river, which delayed Gandalf a lot, and then into the Misty Mountains, or at least the foothills of the Misty Mountains. So then Gandalf ran out of time and returned. And there's not much else that happens that night. They go back to sleep. They wake up in the morning, and Beorn is back, and he is jolly. He has a tale for them about how he went into the mountains and confirmed their tale, which makes him very happy that they were telling the truth. And he did so by apparently threatening to torture and then killing a warg and a goblin, which he brought the skull of the goblin back and the skin of the warg, and showed them the remnants. So Beorn is not bound by the Geneva Conventions, it turns out.
When he says he doesn't like visitors, he means it. This is what he puts up to warn them off, right?
That's right.
So you better have a good tale to tell.
Tale to tell, or no Geneva Convention. So there's so Beorn's very happy. And Gandalf tells them the full purpose of their journeys at that point, and Beorn agrees to give them a bunch of supplies and get them to Mirkwood. And he tells them tales about Mirkwood, which are not very pleasant. And they go to sleep, and the next day they wake up, and they head off. And the reason they're heading off quickly, they actually head off to the north to avoid the goblins, who are now going to do raids and patrols. The goblins, it turns out, are very angry about everything that happened with the death of the Great Goblin and the dwarves and Gandalf, and they don't know about Bilbo, but it turns out it seems like the goblins are actually preparing an army or something that's large enough to threaten the whole region. So anyway, off the dwarves go, and Gandalf goes, and Bilbo goes, and it turns out Bilbo catches sight of a great shadowy bear that trails them all through their travels to Mirkwood, which they reach the next day, I believe, and then at that point, they have to send the ponies back, which the dwarves are of very low character in The Hobbit versus The Lord of the Rings. The dwarves actually consider taking Beorn's ponies with them, even though they agreed to send them back. And basically, it's only the threat of the fact that Gandalf tells them, "Look, Beorn's basically here watching us, and you do not want to have him as an enemy." And they finally agree to, I guess, follow their own word. So anyway, they send the ponies back. Gandalf keeps his horse, though, and leaves them. So with great tearful goodbyes, they go to sleep and wake up again, and then Gandalf leaves them, and they head into Mirkwood. The end of the chapter.
That was nicely detailed. It's like you've read this a few times.
Yeah, sorry. I know I gave probably more details than I had before.
No, I like it. So let's go back to the beginning of this part of the chapter where they're having dinner, right? And the animals come in. Now, this is the first really kind of weird thing. They trotted in the beautiful ponies. He clapped his hands. He said something to them in queer languages. So again, they're animals who are speaking, but he's speaking to them in their language. They're not speaking English. it's not like Narnia
That's
in that
right.
sense, where the animals do speak. So they do have a separate language. However, the dogs could stand on their hind legs when they wished and carry things with their forefeet. Quickly, they got out the boards and the trestles and from the sidewalls and set them up near the fire. And he's got animal slaves. I mean, we might slaughter them. He decides to put them to work to set his table and do his dishes.
You know what's weird about this is, do you think that Beorn serves meat in his house? I realized that I thought that he didn't just because of the animals. I think that was the impression that I got when I first read it. But is there any indication that he serves meat? It just says they had dinner, and then later on, Gandalf eats tons of bread, butter, and honey.
He never
talks about the
mentions meat.
cakes that Beorn has a special recipe for that can stay preserved for a long time. Again, no meat. But he's a bear, so he's got to eat meat. So
he has no problem killing orcs and wolves.
Right,
it's not like he's
presumably he doesn't eat orcs and wolves.
No. I know, but I'm just pointing out, like, slaughtering things is not outside of his nature.
Right, but the question is serving them, and it doesn't say anything about meat, and he has all these animals around, which might be a little odd. If you got goats and such, and
would he do it around the animals? While the sheep are serving the dwarves and the Hobbit and Gandalf, would he bring out lamb chops? Would he bring mutton? That'd be a little awkward.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, what's interesting is this reminds me most of Narnia, and there is a point in Narnia, I can't remember which book it is, when Lewis makes the point about talking animals versus dumb animals, and how because the folks in Narnia hunt and they eat meat, but then there's all these talking animals and they don't hunt them to eat, and so Lewis makes the point that the talking animals are larger and basically they're anthropomorphized animals. They're intelligent and so they're just a different species, a different kind of thing from the dumb versions of themselves, which they are apparently okay eating. So I just don't know if that's what's going on here a little bit too. Tolkien just doesn't say, but it's interesting to think about how like every time specific food is mentioned, there's no meat.
Does Tolkien say what he's wearing in particular? Is he wearing furs or skins?
He does have warg skins, but
he has warg skins.
That might just be trophy.
Yeah. So he was clothed in a tunic of wool down to his knees. So no mention. That's all he says. So no mention of any skins or anything like that either.
Interesting.
Card carrying PETA member. That's Beorn.
I doubt it.
He has no problem with the wargs. I think that's enough.
He slaughters them with alacrity.
All right, so they eat their meal as they are served by the dogs and the sheep. Is there anything else that the horses never come up on their hind legs? I guess
they just come in with torches in their mouths, I guess.
Yeah, they set the table with that. And then they had a supper or a dinner, which that's exactly what Tolkien says. And I'm not sure what the difference is necessarily. I didn't look it up. Is there a difference, Michael? Is this an English thing again?
Yes, dinner is what we call lunch or a late lunch, large late lunch. And supper is what we call dinner. It's the last meal, the last big meal of the day, at least traditionally.
Okay. Anyway, I thought that was interesting because I don't usually we don't make much of a difference in our culture anymore regarding those two things.
No, in fact, most people don't at all. We don't even use the word supper most of the time.
No. So the dwarves, they sit there, they talk about their gold. Beorn gets drowsy. They sat there, and then they after Beorn leaves, the dwarves break out into a song, and this song is really interesting because it's different than, it's not an aspirational song like the Misty Mountain song in the sense of like, we're going to get our gold. This is what we're here for. This is where it is. It's the story of wind. Although it does have the same meter and rhyme scheme.
Exactly. I was going to say it's the same meter and rhyme scheme. There's the group that I really like, that Clamavi de Profundis, that does a great version of the Misty Mountain song, also does this song in the same with the same melody. and pacing. And so yeah, it's
Well,
I,
here, let me read it so that it's fresh in our minds, and
yes.
then we can talk about it. The wind was on the withered heath, but in the forest stirred no leaf. Their shadows lay by night and day, and dark things silent crept beneath. The wind came down from mountains cold, and like a tide it roared and rolled. The branches groaned, the forest moaned, and leaves were laid upon the mold. The wind went on from west to east. All movement in the forest ceased, but shrill and harsh across the marsh its whistling voices were released. The grasses hissed, their tassels bent, the reeds were rattling, on it went, o'er shaken pool under heaven's cool, where racing clouds were torn and rent. It passed the lonely mountain bare, and swept above the dragon's lair. There black and dark lay boulders stark, and flying smoke was in the air. It left the world and took its flight over the wide seas of the night. The moon set sail upon the gale, and stars were fanned to leaping light. It's why the wind. This is where what is the significance of using the wind as the storyteller, right? Essentially coming from, I would guess, the Misty Mountains, right?
Yes.
It could be the Gray Mountains, maybe coming down from the top, but yeah, it could be the Misty Mountains. And then as the story goes on, it eventually, the wind takes flight above the earth. It goes over everything down through the Misty Mountains, and then takes flight above the earth, and is the gust that blows the moon in its courses over the heavens, and fans the stars to light.
Yeah, there's so many fascinating things about this to me. One is all of the actors taking action are non-animal animals or people. So the characters are the wind. So the wind, of course, we watch the whole travels of it. The forest stirs. I guess one you said it's dark things silent crept beneath. That's the only. It isn't specific, but I guess that's the only living thing. You have the forest stirring. Um, a lot's more about the wind. The branches groaned, the forest moaned. Um, he has whistling voices, grasses hissing, the reeds rattling, clouds racing. You have the moon and the stars, the light leaping, smoke flying. So everything that's taking action is non-living, basically. Well, plant or non-living. And so it's a very fascinating. I mean, this is a poem about geography. This is a poem about the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's the actors in it is the world. Like this is to me, this is kind of not a necessary culmination, but kind of the essence of what Tolkien is getting into. Where for him, the world is alive, and he doesn't even need speaking actors, animals, people of any race, to have have a story be told by the in song. So the dwarves have this song presumably, and there are no dwarves in the song. There are no anything except the wind, the things of earth and sky, and that's it. It's kind of interesting, and I wonder, if you think about what is it that I mean, presumably the dwarves invented this song. It's their song, and so there must be a branch of dwarven poetry, which is kind of that's the way my headcanon works anyway, which is that there must be a source of this where the dwarves have this kind of poetry which is about the things of the world, the geography. And for Tolkien, it's just a celebration of Middle Earth. It's all these. It's got this mystery and danger to it, but it's a story about geography. It's wind passing over the land.
It's kind of it mirrors the dwarves a little bit, in the sense that it's halfway through, right? We're starting in the Misty Mountains. That's right where they are. And this is the journey that the dwarves will take. And they start on the withered heath, right? Withered, burned, desolate,
Yep.
uncultivated. There's nothing there. And it's sort of like that's what the dwarves are. They're nowhere. They don't have a land. There's nothing there for them. And so the wind was on the withered heath, and it makes its way around the dark things that are silent crept beneath, right? So the orcs that they had to get through. Um, the wind went from west to east, all movement in the forest ceased. So the move also, so that's one thing, right? The wind, when the dwarves go in the forest, it's eerie, it's quiet, there's nothing there. They don't really see anything until the spiders eventually. Sorry, spoiler everybody. um but all
Almost
movement in the
100
forest
years ago,
ceased.
spoilers.
Yeah. But this wind keeps moving, it keeps going on, and so it feels like it's a little bit of a this is what's going to happen. This is, we are the wind, nothing can stop us. And I don't know if that's the intention, because I hate reading so much into that. But considering where it starts and how it says the wind was on the withered heath, right, on this barren land where a no man's land, and that's what the dwarves are. They're people without a home. They come from no man's land, from nowhere. And so I don't know. And then in the end, right, though, they will get past the dragon's lair where it's black and dark and there are boulders stark. They'll leave the world and take flight over the wide seas of night. The moon sets sail upon the gale. The wind, sort of like an aspirational, like that we're going to be more than just here for the dragon. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into this. And the same wind that started on the withered heath, that started nowhere. Literally, it's not coming from any great hall. It's not coming from any great peak, but from a barren nowheresville. It fans the stars to leaping light. It shines down. It creates a greater light. And who likes the stars the most? The elves, right? And so and who loves the stars the most? Tolkien. So the way it ends is, I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but it just feels very parallel to what's going to happen with the dwarves and where they go and where they end up.
Yeah. Now, the one quibble I have is that the withered heath is an actual place in Tolkien's world.
It is?
Yeah, it's thought to be the home of the dragons, where the dragons were birthed. It's in the extreme part of the Grey Mountains.
Completely wrong. I just looked up withered heath. Okay, I just knew what a withered. I didn't look it up for Tolkien.
Well, no. I mean, it can describe it. It's kind of a generic description. It doesn't have capitals, but it's an actual place. Yeah. So the way I was looking at the map of Middle Earth, and I was thinking, I think the wind does a curve, because there's at one point it goes from west to east. So I think it comes down from the withered heath along the Grey Mountains, down the Misty Mountains, and then across to Erebor, from west to east. So it has to go, because it cuts right, because it has to pass over the Lonely Mountain, right? And then after passing over the Lonely Mountain, it goes on. It just disappears. It goes up into the sky, and the moon carries on, and the motion in the poem. And so I think you have this like capital C motion where it's coming down from the withered heath and through the Misty Mountains, and then going east directly across to Erebor. Funny.
I should have looked up withered heath in Tolkien, not just known like what a heath is and think withered.
I mean, that's why we have two of us, right? So that
makes it more interesting, because now it's like a dragon's wind almost.
Exactly. So it starts with dragons.
Totally wrong.
It starts with dragons and ends with dragons, which is why I think it's very defensible that groups like Clamavi de Profundis, who think of it as another part of the Misty Mountains song of the dwarves, because that song is about the reclaiming of their gold. Maybe this is the first part of that song, where it starts with the dragons, the withered heath, where the dragons are birthed. It ends in the stanzas that we hear this time end in the Lonely Mountain, and then maybe it carries on into the dwarves' lament about what happened at the Lonely Mountain and the fall of Erebor to Smaug. So anyway, I think it's defensible to think of it as the first part of that, especially with the same rhyme scheme and meter. First part of the Misty Mountain song. So anyway.
Okay. All right. Well, that if it's the end of it, it's so much less informative than the first part of the Misty Mountain song. Right?
Well, I think this is the first part. I think they're singing the first part here, and then you have the Misty Mountain song, which, because it's such a long song, I think they just cut into, because they're basically trying to explain to Bilbo what they're doing back in the Shire, and so we get the cut in part into the middle of the song there. I think this is the first part of the song where we're introduced by the wind. And you know what? Robert Jordan, I noticed this when I read Wheel of Time, he does the same thing. He takes the wind at the beginning of certain chapters, and he follows the wind's path from the mountains down into wherever the character is that he's going to talk about. as the main character of this particular chapter. And so I when I first read Robert Jordan, I was like, I mean, that's a cool thing to do. Is like, dude, you're just copying Tolkien. You're not even trying to.
Well, yeah. I mean, he doesn't. Yeah, it's a little bit of a stretch to say he's copying Tolkien by using wind and wind movement.
Well, the wind he starts with the wind in the mountains, and then it blows down, and then it ends up at a character or a place that something's going to happen. And I think that's what's happening here, where we follow the wind from the dragon home, basically, to dragon breeding ground, to the Lonely Mountain, and then it carries on into the first part.
Doesn't Jordan like start every book that way? The prologue or whatever. Yeah, every single book starts with that wind bit. I only read 3 of them because I couldn't finish it. I think I've said that before. All right, so let's move on from that. But let's talk about the talking animals a little bit, because that's another really unique part of this that is nowhere else.
So, are we in Narnia?
Are we in Narnia?
No, we're not in Narnia. Of course,
I'm pretty sure we're not in Narnia.
No,
I don't know what.
So is this the first talking animals that we've had?
No, is it? Wargs,
eagles. Well,
wargs.
Orcs aren't evil.
No. Warg.
Wargs. Oh. They do have... I guess you're right. Wargs. Okay, yep, that's fair. Wargs and then eagles, and now. These animals seem a little comical, like where wargs were made out to be dangerous and deadly, and eagles were made out to be these lofty creatures, which nevertheless were grounded in the sense that they would talk about eating the sheep of men and stuff like that. But they were still, they had a kind of I don't know, distance or the hints of a nobility about them that Tolkien would later blossom into something full blown as the messengers of Manwë, essentially. But these animals don't. These animals are really, really domestic and almost silly. Like the idea, like if you picture in your mind a bunch of horses and goats and sheep and dogs walking on their hind legs. I mean, maybe the horses weren't, but and carrying things around. It's really weird. They don't even have, like, he doesn't have the wargs do that. He doesn't have the eagles act in ways that are contrary to the way a wolf or an eagle would act in a certain sense if you gave them intelligence. So I don't know. Feels like a circus.
Well, yeah, it feels it does, and it's super odd. And that's not to say, and we'll get to it about the dancing bears too. Both of those, it feels very much the anthropomorphization of these animals. And so like we mentioned last week, it's very Dr. Dolittle-ish.
Yeah, there we go. I like that.
And so I looked into it a little bit. Dr. Dolittle in 1923 won the Newbery Award as the best children's book of the year. Okay, so it was very popular then. So it was, speaking to animals acting, serving like humans. It was part of their culture. It was very popular. It's like, I don't know. It's like the Harry Potter, right? We all knew what, like, Avada Kedavra, all that sort of stuff that became part of it. And so in 1993, Christopher Tolkien wrote a letter where he wrote this: "Yes, the Dr. Dolittle books were central and deeply loved in our childhood, and we had the whole series, each new book as it appeared."
Okay.
So I think because of that, because it was deeply loved, right? Not just loved, but deeply loved. They read them there. Tolkien read them to his kids read them again. I think that's probably one of the main reasons why it's in the story, because by talking about saying it to his children, they're like, oh, they're like animals like in Dr. Dolittle. It's a kind of a member berry.
Yeah. But in this case, it's not the corporate money grubbing member berry that we see in Rings of Power. What it is it's the kind of member berry that Gandalf himself is, and other elements of the story where Tolkien is pulling from other books and other works in epic and even non-epic sources, which he then still makes very much a part of his own world. I mean, think about Beorn. The difference between Doolittle and Beorn couldn't be more greater in some like they're both the masters of walking talking animals, but Beorn's a little different from Dr. Dolittle.
Yeah, Yeah, and just so you know, the first language that Tolkien took a part in before, like when he was real little, they called it Animalic, but it had nothing to do with it. It was just like a code where the name of an animal would take the place of a word, like, run. So you'd say, I don't remember. Like, for instance, I looked it up. So if you said dog, nightingale, woodpecker, horse, it meant, hey kids, what are you saying?
Oh, interesting. So
Anyway,
it's just
but
transposition.
Animalic, I was like, because I remembered reading that originally, like, oh, his first language was Animalic. But again, he had a thing for animals and speaking at this point in time, and probably a big part of that was Dr. Dolittle and animals and interacting, because Dr. Dolittle could talk to the animals, right? He could understand them, but not in English, or he would understand their language more. They wouldn't understand. They wouldn't speak back with nouns
and I guess we're going to get
verbs.
more talking animals. I was just thinking about like the thrush and the raven, right?
Oh yeah.
So
interesting.
So he's not going to let go of the talking animals thing.
No. But I think we can say with a lot of confidence, Dr. Dolittle had a big part of it, and as he told it to his children, this was a way where they would love the story even more by putting this into it. Yeah. All right. So they go to sleep. Beorn leaves. They go to sleep. He hears a great animal scuffling at the door and some growling outside. Bilbo wondered what it was. It could be Beorn enchanted shape, blah, blah. So he was afraid. He dove under the blankets and fell asleep again at last in spite of his fear. And with that fear, he woke up in a jump because he was gonna miss breakfast.
Of course.
That was the big thing that got him out of bed. I love that.
Which again, says to him, right, this is what makes hobbits amusing. Only when they're like if it wouldn't be half as amusing if he was back in the Shire and there were other hobbits in his house and he woke up and had almost missed breakfast and they had all eaten breakfast. Like, there's something very funny about the fact that it's him. It's by contrast that we find hobbits' habits amusing.
So they wake up. Gandalf isn't there. Gandalf then returns.
At the end of the day.
At the end of the day, right? Yeah. So they're kind of there by themselves at the end of the day, probably too afraid to go outside. I don't believe they ever leave the hall. They never mentions it, at least. And so he appears and he tells them about Beorn and where he's been. He says, I've been picking out bear tracks. There must have been a regular bears meeting outside here last night. I soon saw that Beorn could not have made them all. There were far too many of them. I should say there were little bears, large bears, ordinary bears, and gigantic bears, all dancing outside from dark to nearly dawn.
Dancing bears.
Now, that's not the only time we have dancing bears.
No, indeed.
And so in this book that came out a few years ago, The Nature of Middle-earth, which takes a bunch of notes and brings it all together into all about the people and animals of Middle-earth, or the animals, sorry, not the people, the animals, the flora and fauna of Middle-earth. And he talks about the great Dancing Bears of Númenor. So I'm going to read this little bit here to say, I don't know when this was written, but since it had to be after this, because Númenor was an invention of Tolkien's when he was going to write a time travel story. And so that was after he wrote The Hobbit. Okay, so Tolkien writes this. There were bears in considerable numbers in the mountains or rocky parts, both of a black and brown variety. The great black bears were found mostly in the forest star. The relations of the bears and the men were strange. From the first, the bears exhibited friendship and curiosity towards the newcomers, and these feelings were returned. At no time was there any hostility between men and bears, though at mating times and during the first youth of their cubs, they could be angry and dangerous if disturbed. The Númenorians did not disturb them except by mischance. Very few Númenorians were ever killed by bears, and these mishaps were not regarded as reasons for war upon the whole race. So they will never, the Númenorians never took to war against the bears because there were mishaps of humans killed by bears. So many of the bears were quite tame. They never dwelt in or near the homes of men, but they would often visit them in the casual manner of one householder calling upon another. Do you have any honey?
A little bit of only an occasion coming through there.
Only an occasional bad bear ever raided the tame hives. Most strange of all were the bear dances. The bears, the black bears especially. Why? because the brown bears had a little bit more pride. Sorry, I added that. The black bears especially had curious dances of their own, but these seem to have become improved and elaborated by the instruction of men. At times, the bears would perform dances for the entertainment of their human friends. The most famous was the Great Bear Dance of Tompole, I don't know, in the Forestar, in which every year in the autumn many would come from all parts of the island, since it occurred not long after the Eruhantale, at which a great concourse was assembled. To those not accustomed to the bears, the slow but dignified motions of the bears, sometimes as many as 50 or more together, appeared astonishing and comic, but it was understood by all admitted to the spectacle that there should be no open laughter. The laughter of men was a sound that the bears could not understand. It alarmed and angered them. What in the world? I mean, honestly, that's Tolkien writing a whole page about Dancing Bears of Númenor. Like, this was not something he wrote as 2 sentences. He wrote an entire treatise on why the bears danced and how they interacted with humans. I mean, he never did anything halfway when it came to creating his world, but
right.
Wow.
Well, and the fact that The Hobbit came first, when you were talking about the dances of the black bears, I thought about the second time Bilbo goes to sleep here, and he says, "And while dwarves were still singing songs, he dropped asleep, still puzzling his little head about Beorn, till he dreamed a dream of hundreds of black bears dancing slow, heavy dances round and round in the moonlight in the courtyard." So he wrote that first, presumably.
Mm-hmm.
I think if that line was in the 1937 edition, I didn't look this up actually, but he writes this first, and then he goes on. It just feels like it's almost like it's one of those just sparks of imagination where I can imagine him sitting there with his pipe and a mug of tea one afternoon and just musing about Númenor, and then this thought comes into his head about dancing bears, and he just decides, yeah, there were bears in Númenor, and starts writing.
Yeah, I know. I would guess like maybe dancing. This is completely without any research, but the dancing bears. When I think of dancing bears, for some reason, I think of Russian dancing bears because I've seen these videos of people in Russia who have essentially lived with these tame bears and things like that. And so I'm sure that was part of the circuses and those sorts of things that would come out and about in Europe at the time, and even here in America, you would have these bears on their hind legs doing tricks and dancing and wearing, weird clothes and hats and stuff like that. But maybe this was him trying to say, like, no, bears are dignified. We shouldn't be treating them this way, and we're not going to laugh at them for this. This is not a laughing matter.
But they did, improve the bears dancing. Apparently, right?
They did.
There's some element of animal husbandry going on there, but not to the level of Beorn and his talking animals, and definitely not to the level of trained pets the way we have nowadays. Where we bring.
Yeah, it was. They were part of the original Ringling Brothers, Barnum and L. Ross circus.
Well done.
That was pretty bad. Yeah, I don't know.
Barnum and Elros.
Yeah, it's like you can't say Ernie and Elros. Anyway, okay, all right. So the dancing bears. I don't know how much more time we can spend on that, but yeah, it's an interesting
aside.
It just seems aside, yeah, and then it's not just a one-off. It's not just like the fox that talked once, right, or thought once. It's the bears here and the bears of Númenor, and Bilbo has the dream later. Where he does say he dreamt them, like you said, slow heavy dances round and round in the moonlight in the courtyard, but he hears the snuffling, the scraping, but this morning he's not awakened with a fear of breakfast. He's awakened by Beorn over the top of him saying, "So here you are all still, not eaten up by wargs or goblins or wicked bears yet, I see." Wicked bears. So the dancing bears is what they dream of, and he says wicked bears. And I think this says, like, Beorn has a certain sense of humor right here, because he said, it's like, I can imagine him poking Bilbo's belly and saying, "Little bunny is getting nice and fat again on bread and honey. Come and have some more. I'm gonna fatten you up."
Exactly.
Right?
That's
what it feels like.
Fattening you up thing. I also caught this time the rhyme scheme, so I could hear him say, "Little bunny is getting nice and fat again on bread and honey." And,
oh yeah.
And so he's just sort of making a random poem up. But this also reinforced what my belief that that there's no meat in his house because his statement is
Yeah.
about how Bilbo's getting fat on bread and honey. There's nothing else to eat, I guess. Which is, that's all Gandalf eats when Gandalf comes back famished, and
Right.
and so so it's interesting. But yeah, Beorn is very happy.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny. I think by saying little bunny, it reminds us again that Bilbo might have gotten away, but he's still prey. He's still not Beorn.
Yeah,
Don't think of him as the hero yet.
that's true. Good point.
Okay, and this is where Beorn says, man, I keep saying Beorn because it's Beorn. I want to say Beorn. Where he says to Gandalf, it was a good story, that of yours, but I like it still better now that I'm sure it is true.
Mm-hmm.
You must forgive me for not taking your word. If you lived near the edge of Mirkwood, and you would not take the word of no one that you did not know as well as your brother or better. And so part of me wonders is like, why did Beorn leave? Well, I think he left not just to go dance the night away at the bear rave. he wanted to check to see if this story was actually true, because again, he doesn't trust his visitors, right? He's got a skull and a skin hanging out there to ward people away, essentially. And so he goes out and like, yeah, okay, the story is true.
This would be the name of this episode, Big Bear Rave.
The Big Bear Rave. All right, I'm writing it down. Here we go. But yeah, it's like he doesn't believe him, and so when he finds out his story is true, I feel like now he fully trusts Gandalf.
Exactly.
Right? He only knew Radagast before. Now he knows who Gandalf is. He trusts Gandalf and his story, and I think that is what leads him into supporting them as they leave for Mirkwood, where he not only gives them ponies to use and other food, he actually follows them and protects them. He's there to make sure they get to where they're going. Either that, or maybe he's concerned about their ponies because he knows the dwarves too. So maybe it's a little bit of both, actually.
Yeah, a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. What I like is the tale that he gets from the goblin and the warg before he kills them, is that they were mad. And I love, there's 3 reasons that the wargs and goblins were mad. 1, they killed the great goblin. 2, they killed a bunch of the chief warg's head servants. And 3, they burnt the chief warg's nose.
That's like
one of these things is not like the other. Okay, so we're really angry because you killed a bunch of our leaders. Also, you burnt this guy's nose. Okay, got it.
Well, yeah, that's it's their sniffer. It's the way they get around.
Yeah. And Bjorn's really impressed by the fact they killed the Great Goblin. He keeps repeating it. So he's very pleased. Bjorn hates goblins, and basically the fact that their tale turned out to be true, he's now really good friends with them. So gives them some, like we've already talked about, all these supplies, including his secret recipe for travel bread, way bread of some kind. Bjorn way bread,
like a Lembas predecessor.
Yeah, Bjorn bread is a predecessor.
Bjorn bread. Can we that would be great to sell that Bjorn bread?
Exactly. It like Lembas, it has honey in it too. I think both are mentioned.
Yeah.
So
yeah, okay.
It's really interesting though. Thinking about this is that what Bjorn never says anything about, and I wonder if it's because this is the way Tolkien conceived of the story and just hadn't come to him when he doesn't say anything about the elves at all. Like the elves, he has to know about the elves' kingdom in Mirkwood. He knows all about Mirkwood. He talks a great deal about lots of details about what to do and not do in Mirkwood, and the stream that's there, and stay on the path, and all this stuff, and how he has an idea of how long it'll take them to move through. He never says a single thing about elves, so that's interesting.
That's a good point. I didn't.
But anyway,
the elves just leave them alone.
Yeah. Says nothing about spiders either, but I guess those are the dark things creeping beneath the in the dwarf song. So he probably thinks they already know about that.
Yeah. All right, so he sends them on his way, or he sends them on their way.
Yep.
They leave. He gives them directions where to go. He gives them some ponies. Gandalf is on a horse, and they make their way to Mirkwood. And in that time, Bilbo notices that, like you said, the shadow of the bear. As the light faded, Bilbo thought he saw away to the right or to the left the shadowy form of a great bear prowling along in the same direction. But he dared to mention it to Gandalf, the wizard. But if he dared to mention it to Gandalf, the wizard only said, "Hush, take no notice." Remember, Beorn called him a bunny.
Yeah, that's
this
right.
is not so he's like, don't look in his eyes, don't notice that he's there. It's an interesting thing. It's sort of like the pride of the way that I read is the pride of Beorn would not brook the idea that he's actually here to help out these other people,
Right.
or if he cares enough about them. That's kind of the way that I read it.
Although, like you said, given the dwarves' attitude, maybe he's there to watch over his property. So there's that.
Yeah, and Gandalf does say, Beorn is not as far off as you seem to think, and you had better keep your promises anyway, for he is a bad enemy. So I think it's this whole sequence of like
dwarves are the worst, man. They're like these mean, petty little creatures. The fact that it just ticks me off when I was reading this, like the fact that they wanted to just keep the ponies.
But you've got a horse,
are
Gandalf?
Yeah,
it's like
well, that's like, and they got petty. Like, you know, Gandalf is pointing out that they're supposed to give back the ponies. They're like, but you're doing this, so you know.
Thorin says, "You don't mention sending that back." Gandalf says, "I don't, because I'm not sending it." Like, well, okay. But the thing is that you're not going to bring the ponies into Mirkwood. You're not going to bring the horse into Mirkwood.
Because Gandalf's point is I'm not going into Mirkwood. In other words, presumably he would send the horse back if he was going into Mirkwood with them, but he's not. So and also presumably he is going to send the horse back when he's done with it, just like they're sending the ponies back now that they're done with them, because the ponies ain't going into Mirkwood. So, anyway. It is interesting too, from the time they leave Beorn's house to the time that they have they reach Mirkwood. It's like 2.5 pages of just Tolkien describing their travels and the land that they're going through and the flora and fauna. So Tolkien's really, really coming into his own. You know, the difference between this and like the meager half a paragraph from the beginning of when he leaves the Shire, Bilbo leaves the Shire, and before the trolls. Is, you know, a couple paragraphs is there's a real difference I see anyway. Tolkien's really leaning into and developing his world itself, the world.
Yeah, it's this passage that I thought was his most descriptive yet, at least for a time. And this is where he writes about their passage toward Mirkwood. By his advice, Beorn's advice, they were no longer making for the main forest road to the south of the land. Had they followed the pass, their path would have led them down a stream from the mountains that joined the great river miles south of the Carrick. At that point, there was a deep ford which they might have passed if they had still had their ponies. And beyond that, a track led to the skirts of the wood and to the entrance of the old forest. But Beorn had warned them that way now was often used by the goblins, while the forest road itself, he had heard, was overgrown and disused at the eastern end and led to impassable marches where the paths had long been lost. There is a lot of geography in just that description in getting to Mirkwood. And that's when I read that, I think back to how much he changed in his unpublished revisions to The Hobbit and his attempted rewrite of it that we went over, because he changed so much of the first couple chapters of The Hobbit. And one of them was, for instance, when they came up on the goblins, the trolls, sorry, and how much more description there was of the land around it. And I think at this point, he's at that point where the land is important enough to demand that much detail about it, even in just a directional sense. We're not heading east on the path. We're heading east on the path that would have led them down by a stream from the mountains that joined the great river miles south of the Carrick, where there was a deep ford that might have passed if they still had their ponies, and beyond that track led to the skirts. So it's this whole passage. He sees it in his head and he brings it out. Maybe that's just becoming more engaged in the story too, but I think it's also his improved writing after doing it for 100 and some odd pages at this point.
That's true.
Yeah,
I agree.
Okay. All right. So at this point, Gandalf leaves them with some more humor. Beorn has humor. Gandalf has humor, where he says to them about Mirkwood. Let me get that right. Where is it? Here he says, "Well, here's Mirkwood," said Gandalf, "the greatest of the forests of the northern world. I hope you like the look of it." It's like it's dark, overgrown. Nothing is good there. Don't drink the water there. Don't bring the ponies in there. But I hope you like the look of it. it's it's this. Gandalf loves like needling them a little bit, right? He's not safe, right? That's what.
Yep.
That's what's said later. And so even in that, it's almost like he's trying to lighten the mood. And he says again later, he's like, remember, there are no safe paths in this part of the world. Remember, you are over the edge of the wild now, and in for all sorts of fun wherever you go. So Mirkwood, Beorn is fun, the eagles are fun, the orcs are fun, the stone giants were like, so he realizes like, okay, now everything is just fun. Just have a good attitude, change the way that you look at the world.
I mean, it's such the opposite of the snowflake mentality that we tend to have nowadays. It's refreshing. It's just,
Yeah. And it's a little bit of a dark humor.
It is dark humor. And that's a natural thing that existed in every culture, or most cultures that I've ever encountered. But our culture, I guess we have a kind of dark humor, but it's a little over the top, and people don't use it in normal discussion. You have these movies and TV shows which are based on dark humor, but it's pretty vile a lot of the time.
Yeah. But Gandalf, a little bit of dark humor with the uncouth dwarves is okay, and the bunny. Hey, remember the bunny? Wasn't it the Hobbit, the rabbit? We did some AI stuff with the Hobbit rabbits.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, see, he's the bunny Bilbo Baggins. I should bring that back. All right. Anything else you have about this chapter? Because now we're going to be diving into the real danger.
Yeah. Now we get to Mirkwood next chapter. But no, this feels a lot more like, after Beorn, it just starts to feel like Middle Earth. In a lot of ways, like the way he describes it, the danger, the kind of wonders he comes across. Beorn is interesting because Beorn feels to me like something from a slightly different kind of world. It's I think telling that we do have a reference to Beorn, but we don't. He just doesn't lean into Beorn at all in the Lord of the Rings. So I find what happens after Beorn, like Beorn is just, his attitude is, I mean, in a way he has kind of the same feeling as Tom Bombadil. There's a little bit of that sort of blithe mastery of the natural world and danger, but also just sort of, a hermit in the land. And with his own world and his own, like, we never get the sense, interestingly enough, that Beorn is in any danger. You have, like, we're told that basically the entire people of this region are in danger from the goblins and the wargs, but you get no hint that Beorn is in any danger at all. He just seems to be the Tom Bombadil of the Hobbit, in that a fiercer version of Tom Bombadil, but nevertheless. But then the leaning into the danger, the mystery and the darkness and the beauty and the wonder of the land of Middle Earth seems to really be a focus for Tolkien after the House of Beorn, and I love it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that more in a couple weeks. We'll be doing chapter 8, Flies and Spiders. So we get some. We get
more talking animals,
baby Shelobs, more talking animals. That's true. Now talking insects,
right? Animals. The spiders are they talk. They don't just.
Yeah, they actually. You're right. And
Shelob doesn't.
They hate being called names. So not only do they talk, just like the wargs, right, and the orcs, right? They hate being talked down to. These thin-skinned animals,
mocked. They are indeed. They are indeed that. Well, the spiders are
hide.
Yeah,
exoskeletons. Yeah, they're soft on the inside. That's for sure. All right, everybody. Well, we're gonna hang up on this part of it, but we will answer the call as we get into our extended podcast. We'll talk a little bit more about Beorn and some comments from some of the folks in our chat. And next week, 2 weeks, join us for chapter 8 of Flies and Spiders. So if you want to hear our extended podcast and get into the next chat we're going to have, go to the onewing.com/member or the onewing.com/Patreon. Become a member for $4 a month. First month is free when you go to the onewing.com/member. All right, everybody. We'll see you on the other side.
Take care, freeloaders.